This video is brought to you by Surfshark. Safety and security online are super important. You can protect yourself online with Surfshark. Get 83% off and 3 months for free through the link in the description below. On May the 18th, 1980, the United States witnessed the most destructive volcanic event in its history. In Washington state, Mount St. Helens erupted with the force of a hydrogen bomb. The eruption removed the top of the 1,300-foot mountain and sent volcanic debris shooting out at over 650 miles an hour. Within seconds, superheated ash had engulfed ridges over 6 miles away. Ancient trees were torn apart like matchsticks, while the entire Spirit Lake campsite was lost beneath hundreds of feet of material. All told, some 230 square miles of wilderness were annihilated that morning, but the human cost was also horrific. 57 people were killed, making the eruption to date the deadliest to happen on US soil. Yet there was more to what happened at Mount St. Helens than a mere tragedy. For the blast to be so deadly, it required not just innumerable slip-ups, but also outright incompetence on the part of state officials, incompetence that led to 57 people losing their lives. Today we're bringing you the untold story of Mount St. Helens and how a natural event became an American disaster. It was 5:30 in the morning when the sun rose on a clear day in Washington state. Out on a remote mountain ridge known as Coldwater II, David Johnston was just waking up from his first night in the wild. A genially scruffy man in his early 30s, Johnston was a part of the US Geological Survey team that had been dispatched to the Cascade Range a couple of months before. Now, as the birds started to screech in the forest below, the geologist stumbled over the uneven ground to his collection of instruments. It was still cool in this part of the world, the sun not yet having crested the ridge. As he shivered in the half-light, Johnston performed his checks on the volcano before him. The giant, unstable volcano that had caused such a media sensation that spring of 1980. Known as Mount St. Helens, the volcano had remained dormant for over a century. But now, as Johnston watched, it was waking up, a great bulge forming on its side that was growing anywhere between 2 and 6 feet every day. Little could Johnston have known it on the morning of May the 18th, but Mount St. Helens was now just hours away from coming back to life with a deafening roar. And when it did, he would be among the very first victims. The story of Mount St. Helens technically starts in prehistory, 40,000 years ago to be precise. That's when the volcano's oldest ash deposits are dated to, long before human civilization ever emerged. But that's just the beginnings of the volcanoes, the laying of the foundations. The actual mountain itself didn't begin forming until much closer to our time, around 180 BC. By that time, what is now Washington state was already inhabited. We don't know what the first Native Americans to see Mount St. Helens in action called it, but we do know that the name eventually passed down to one tribe was Louwala-Clough, or the Smoking Mountain. Naturally, when the Europeans arrived, they completely ignored this and were like, hey look, another unnamed mountain that we get to name. Yay! So it was during George Vancouver's 1790 expedition that Louwala-Clough became Mount St. Helens. At that stage, the volcano was in one of its dormant periods, so no one actually realized how explosive it could be. It was only when 1835 rolled around and it started spewing superheated gases that everyone realized it was no ordinary mountain. That cycle of activity continued for over 2 decades until one big-ass eruption in 1842 that could have been a disaster had more people been living there. But things soon calmed down, and in 1857 the volcano gave one last fiery earth fart before falling silent again. But just because the mountain was quiet doesn't mean it was ignored. Volcanologists, geologists, and lots of other dudes with jobs ending in ologist knew the Cascade Mountain Range was an active place. As early as 1978, Mount St. Helens was identified as crazy active, even for the Cascades. It was so active, in fact, that some were predicting it would erupt before the end of the 20th century. It's curious today to wonder if anyone laughed these predictions off, if anyone told that pack of ologists, stop scaremongering, it's obviously gonna be fine. If they did, then what happened next must have been cold comfort to those volcanic Cassandras. In a mere 2 years, they were going to be proven right in the worst possible way. On On March 16, 1980, Mount St. Helens announced the end of its slumber with a cascade of earthquakes and minor phreatic explosions. Over the next few days, they stopped being quite so minor and became actively worrying. There was the 4.2 earthquake on March the 20th that caused avalanches, the explosion on March the 27th that sent ash spewing 6,000 feet into the sky. But this was just the volcano clearing its throat, like a performer trying to catch the audience's attention before their act. Far more worrying for experts was the changing face of the mountain itself. Among those experts was David Johnston. One of the first geologists onto the scene that spring, Johnston was uniquely placed to see what was happening at Mount St. Helens. It's doubtful he liked what he saw. On the north side of the mountain, a great bulge was beginning to form as magma built up underneath the surface. Over a mile wide, the bulge would grow 260 feet outwards over the next 2 months, a speed almost incomprehensible in geology terms. This change spooked the authorities enough that on April 3rd, a state of emergency was declared in Washington. Almost a month later, on May 2nd, Governor Dixy Lee Ray ordered the establishment of a 5-mile red exclusion zone around the mountain. This wasn't nearly enough. You know that bit in Jaws where the heroes keep being all like, "You need to close the beach," and the mayor is all like, "People have the right to be eaten," and so on? Well, that's what sort of happened in Washington state over the spring of 1980. Only instead of a single shark, the monster was a giant stone bomb with the power to devastate the entire area. The problem was the red zone was simply too small to function. Rather than circling the volcano completely, it hugged the boundaries of private lands, particularly that belonging to logging companies. In other words, its limits were based not on science, but on property rights. Across the early days of May, scientists and law enforcement both argued for a wider red zone. At the same time, logging companies, cabin owners, and wannabe gawkers all piled on the pressure for the zone to be shrunk even further. It was just a volcano, they argued. There'd be plenty of warning before it went up, and up was exactly where it would go. The idea that Mount St. Helens might not explode vertically, but horizontally, seems to have never occurred to anyone. As the arguments raged, the bulge kept growing. It kept growing as evacuation orders were served to those living in the exclusion zone. It kept growing as the press foolishly made heroes of those who chose to stay behind. It kept growing as David Johnston and the USGS monitored the situation, sure something was about to happen. Finally, on May 7th, the mountain entered a frenzy. The bulge was growing 5 feet daily. Steam explosions and earthquakes were getting out of control. It was clear a serious eruption was coming, although no one could say for sure when it would happen. 24 hours before the catastrophe struck, a report landed on Governor Ray's desk, the result of a week's intense lobbying. It included an urgent proposal to vastly expand the red zone to the west, evacuating the supposedly safe area where most of the eruption's victims would ultimately die. All the proposal needed was Dixy Lee Ray's signature, but she never gave it. That Saturday, she avoided her office, instead going to a parade. By the time she finally saw the report, it would already be too late. Unfortunately, it's never too late to secure your internet with a VPN, which is exactly what today's sponsor, Surfshark, can do for you. If you use the internet, if you've got personal information you'd rather remain private, well, you need a VPN. The internet is a weird place. There are people out there who want to ruin your day, they want to take your details, they want to steal your identity, which is a pain in the ass. Surfshark has something called HackLock. This searches database for your passwords, which sounds bad, but don't sweat it. Surfshark are the good guys. They'll let you know if they find your password out there. You can change that password and boom, suddenly you're back in that warm comfort of safety. And while you're in that warm comfort of safety, why not see what's on Netflix? But oh no, you've watched everything on Netflix because you're a massive Netflix consumer. Well, good news, you can use Surfshark VPN, flip over your region to somewhere else. I don't know where you're based, but if you're in the UK, flip it to the US or vice versa, or maybe Japan or Germany or I don't know, somewhere else, to get more Netflix content. Also, Surfshark is totally unlimited, so if you want to download a movie in raw 8K or something, well, go nuts. Also, of course, there's no logs kept, which is great for your privacy. Also, great support and 30 days money back if you don't like it. You can get 83% off and 3 months for free through the link in the description below, or by just using my code, Geographics. Easy. Let's get back to the video. When David Johnston woke early at Coldwater II on the morning of May the 18th, 1980, he was the only man for miles around. The night before, he'd travelled up with some geology students to take up his post watching the volcano. They'd wanted to camp out with him, but had sent them home saying it was too dangerous. As a result, the closest person to him was now Gerry Martin, an amateur ham radio operator camped on another ridge 2 miles distant. Yet the two weren't the only ones who'd soon find themselves directly in the line of devastation that was unleashed by Mount St. Helens. Down at Spirit Lake, Harry Truman was also entering his final minutes. Since you probably remember if the 33rd president had died in a volcanic blast, we're obviously talking about a different Harry Truman. But for a few weeks that spring, he'd be even more famous than his predecessor. The octogenarian owner of a popular campground, Truman was one of only 3 people in the red zone that morning, and the only one there illegally. His refusal to evacuate from the camp he'd co-owned with his late wife for 40 years had turned him into a folk hero, a little guy standing up to these pen pushers from the government. It helped that his personality was as colourful as an explosion in a paint factory. A former combat veteran and Prohibition bootlegger, Truman still concocted his own hooch in a still labelled Panther's Pea. He ate cow brains for breakfast. When the Mount St. Helens earthquake started, his only concession to safety was to start sleeping in the basement. Naturally, the press loved him. Truman was portrayed as a romantic, almost an outlaw type, a portrayal that earned him 3 proposals of marriage from fans across the nation. But Truman was an outlier as far as Mount St. Helens victims went. Most of those killed that Sunday were ordinary, normal people who thought they were out of danger. The Seibold family, for example, were driving the back roads trying to get a view of the volcano that was all over the news. Their 2 kids were playing with a cassette recorder, mock-interviewing the parents about the trip. One of the last recordings they made was asking if it was safe to be this close to the lava. Both parents laughingly said that it was fine. Clyde Croft, too, assumed he was safe. A Vietnam veteran, he was camping outside the red zone with his friend Al Handy. They'd pitched beside Green River and hadn't expected anything more from that weekend than a taste of the great outdoors. There were others, too. Others, like 52-year-old artist Velvetia Tute, who was spending the weekend painting the mountain. Or there was Joel Colten, who stopped next to a roadblock that morning to take photos. Or there was the Parker family, who were developing a gold and silver mine. Or Wally Bowers, who was working as a logger at weekends to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. All of these lives and dozens more would be snuffed out in an instant when the mountain blew. But only David Johnston and Gerry Martin would see their deaths coming. At 8:32 a.m. on Sunday the 18th of May 1980, the 2 men were looking directly at the volcano's north face as it began to spectacularly give way. The last anyone heard of Johnston was his distorted voice as he tried to radio the news back to the USGS base in Vancouver, Washington. "Vancouver!" he shouted. "Vancouver, this is it!" For those near the volcano, the apocalypse had begun. The trigger for the deadliest volcanic blast in US history was a 5.1 magnitude quake that struck 1 mile beneath Mount St. Helens. The mountain was so unstable that the quake caused the bulge to collapse, triggering the largest non-submarine landslide in recorded history. But of course, no one had time to think about that. As the bulge roared down the mountainside, the pressure that had been steadily building beneath it for 2 months was suddenly released. As one magazine memorably put it, it was like popping a champagne cork. A cubic kilometer of boiling ash and debris shot out in barely a second. Over at Coldwater II, David Johnston had just enough time to grab his radio and shout a warning before the deadly cloud swept over the ridge, burying him alive. The blast moved at over 670 miles an hour, rolled over ridges like a dust storm, clinging to the ground, coiling into valleys, flattening forests, and choking the life out of anything in its path. 2 miles distant to Coldwater II, Gerry Martin had a handful of seconds to realize what was happening, just long enough to say his last words. "The camper in the car just over to the south of me are covered," he told his ham radio. "It's going to get me too." And then, nothing but silence. As the plume of ash swept outside the red zone, it completely filled in and buried Spirit Lake. Unlike with David Johnston and Gerry Martin, we have no idea what Harry Truman was doing as the 100-story cloud buried him. Maybe he was sleeping. Maybe he was enjoying his last seconds on Earth with his beloved cats. Either way, the ash was so hot when it hit him that it's unlikely he felt any pain. Heat shock kills in less than a second, far too fast for your brain to comprehend the signals it's receiving. As his niece later told reporters, it's doubtful he'd have wanted to survive the destruction of his camping lodge anyway. By now, every tree in a 6-mile radius of the volcano had been destroyed. Spirit Lake had been filled with debris, and the landslide was thundering down the Toutle River valley, burying everything in its path. And still, the destruction wasn't over. As the ash radiated outward away from the volcano, the danger of instant death from heat shock began to dissipate. In its place came a far nastier fate. On their lonely road, the Seibold family's car was overtaken by the cloud. All 4 of them choked to death, their lungs filling with ash as thick as cement. They weren't the only ones to meet this end. Clyde Croft, the Vietnam veteran who'd been camping with a friend, survived the initial blast, diving into a river as the cloud overtook their sight. He then wrapped himself in his sleeping bag and managed to walk 8 miles, nearly to safety, before finally suffocating on the ash that had slowly filled his airways. But even as the heat dissipated, the eruption remained damaging. There were mudflows, floods, smaller landslides that unleashed devastation, making the area almost impossible to escape. Up to 17 miles from the eruption, trees were torn up by their roots. 45 miles distant, the rivers got so hot that salmon leapt out onto the banks. All told, 230 square miles were annihilated. Roads were destroyed, bridges swept away, and parks buried beneath a blanket of ash. Up to 7,000 big game animals like bears and elk were killed alongside countless birds and small mammals. Hundreds of miles away, people heard the sound of the blast. As far distant as Montana, heavy ash began falling like snow. When the sideways flow at last exhausted itself, the mountain began to belch a vast ash cloud directly upwards, 12 miles into the sky. Lightning flashed in its depths, starting forest fires. A couple of geologists who'd been surveying the bulge from a small plane and narrowly missed being killed snapped off pictures of the damage. Already it was clear the mountain had blown its entire top off. 1,300 feet was missing from the summit. As ash poured out into a sky below which lay 57 dead people, there was just one uneasy fact on experts' minds. This was likely still only the beginning. Although the Mount St. Helens eruption would only cause 4 more indirect deaths, 2 people killed in car crashes due to low visibility and 2 who suffered heart attacks, it would still wreak havoc. The vast ash cloud would eventually travel around the entire world, but it was the Pacific Northwest that suffered the most. As it moved, the ash ruined crops, brought down power lines, and caused widespread blackouts. It clogged pumps, poisoned water, grounded airplanes, and in some places reduced visibility to almost zero. Car engines clogged with it seized up. People who breathed it in suffered respiratory problems, leading to widespread closures of everything from schools to airports to roads. On the less severe end of the scale, the eruption also caused a run on pantyhose of all things, which could be wrapped around air filters for protection from the ash. As with the physical damage, the economic damage was vast. It's estimated that overall the eruption cost somewhere in the region of $1 billion, which is crazy money, especially for 1980. Finally, after a whole day of continuous eruption, the emissions from Mount St. Helens at last began to lessen around 5:30 p.m. By then, rescue teams were scrambling to evacuate survivors trapped in the now ironically named safe area. Some pulled off miraculous escapes. Many others didn't. Although the eruption ceased by Monday, May 19th, the volcano would be rocked by more blasts across the summer and all the way into fall. Yet none of the subsequent eruptions would have anywhere near the impact of the one on May 18th. Of the 57 people who died that day, all but 3 of them had been outside the red zone established by Governor Dixy Lee Ray. Incredibly, this death toll could have been much worse. Within the area inundated with ash were logging grounds owned by private companies. Had the volcano gone off on a weekday, there would have been hundreds of men working there. Instead, it was just lone guys like poor Wally Bowers logging at the weekend to raise money for his wife's cancer treatment. Yet, despite the near miss and despite the lack of fault on the part of the victims, that wasn't the story the public heard. The day after the tragedy, Governor Ray went on TV and declared that every single one of the 57 victims had ignored her warnings and traveled inside the red zone. In reality, only Harry Truman could be considered in the zone illegally. The other 2 in the red zone had received permission, while the remaining 54 victims had all been where the state's own maps told them they'd be safe. Still, this didn't stop a false narrative from quickly being constructed. When President Jimmy Carter arrived to visit the disaster site, he repeated the myth that the victims had ignored warnings. In the end, it would take a 1985 court case to establish that the dead had not been at fault. By then, though, the devastated landscape around Mount St. Helens would already be on its way to recovery. There's a dryly amusing anecdote about the extent of devastation caused by Mount St. Helens. As President Carter was being flown towards the disaster site, he glanced out of the window and saw nothing but dead trees as far as the eye could see. The story goes that he murmured to himself, "Look at that incredible devastation." The head of the Forest Service, who was sitting next to him at the time, awkwardly cleared his throat and said that this was just the result of private logging. The volcano was still miles in front of them. While that tale may only raise the ghost of a smile, it's only because there's very little about Mount St. Helens' aftermath that's worth smiling about. The green and fertile landscape around the volcano was gone, replaced by broken trees and endless swaths of grey. Almost everything living had been buried under piles of ash. The result was a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Most of those who saw it judged it to be about as hospitable. There were predictions that the affected area would never recover. In a sense, it never did. The forests and lakes around Mount St. Helens never went back to how they were before. There was just too much that had changed, too many ways the landscape had altered to return to its pre-eruption state. But that doesn't mean it was as dead as everyone thought it was. Before the summer had passed, there were already signs of returning life. Some plants and small animals that were still beneath the winter ice survived the eruption and emerged to discover that they'd lost their natural predators. So there was a population explosion of things like frogs, which presumably regarded Mount St. Helens not as a disaster, but rather as an awesome improvement. The return of wildlife was helped by a sincere attempt to clear the landscape as best as possible. Millions of tons of ash were removed, taken away, and dumped in landfills. Dead timber was recovered by the Forest Service, who planted 10 million new trees in the place of felled firs. Congress even got in on the act, creating the National Volcanic Monument in 1982 to help study the after effects of large-scale eruptions. And wonderfully, this all worked. Within only a couple of years, life was defiantly returning to the slopes of Mount St. Helens. Trees regrew, plants came back, animal populations balanced. Today, the area has more biological diversity than anywhere else in Washington state. And yet, the story's not over. Although the 1980 eruption blew its top clean off, Mount St. Helens isn't dead. It's not even dormant. In the first decade of the 21st century, the volcano repeatedly expelled magma, creating brand new lava domes. In 2016, clusters of earthquakes were again registered far below its surface, signaling that the volcano is active. Fast forward to the here and now, and Mount St. Helens remains the most active volcano in the entire Cascade Range. According to the USGS, the volcano is one of the Cascades most likely to erupt again in our lifetimes, although they stress it probably won't be anywhere near as devastating as last time. It's clear then that the story of Mount St. Helens itself is still far from its final page, nor is the volcano the only thing that's still alive. Although it has since been overshadowed by natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, Mount St. Helens still looms large in the public's imagination. The damage it caused and the 57 lives it claimed remain the benchmark for volcano tragedies in the United States. While its victims may be gone, so long as there are people who are interested in this grandest of American disasters, then their stories will continue to live on. So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.